The neon red light of the Broken Spoke Saloon flickered against the twilight sky of South Austin, a buzzing beacon that had called to wayward souls and honky-tonk heroes for generations. The air inside was thick with the scent of sawdust, stale Lone Star beer, and 70 years of heartache soaked into the wooden floorboards. It was a place where time didn't just stand still, it sat down at the bar and ordered a whiskey. In the corner booth, far away from the small crowd gathering for the Thursday night two-step lessons, sat a man who didn't need an introduction, though he would never ask for one. George Strait adjusted the brim of his resistol hat, his eyes scanning the low ceiling where photographs of legends gathered dust. He wasn't here for the applause or the cold beer. He was here because the ghosts of 1982 were louder tonight than they had been in 40 years. He looked down at his hands, weathered and strong, resting on the scarred oak table. In his mind, he could still hear the echo of that specific night in this very room. It was a closed session, just him, a single microphone, and a reel-to-reel tape recorder that hummed like a dying insect. They had called it The Lost Session, a collection of songs so raw and stripped back that the record label deemed them too sad for radio. But those songs weren't meant for the radio. They were meant for a promise made to a group of Vietnam veterans who had scraped together their last dollars to buy a plot of land west of San Antonio, a sanctuary they called the Iron Horse Ranch. That ranch was now weeks away from foreclosure, drowning in a sea of modern debt and bureaucratic indifference. The rights to that 1982 session, now digitized and valued at millions by collectors, were the only lifeline left. George checked his pocket watch, a habit from a time before screens ruled the world. It was time to go. He stood up, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt toward him, the gravity of a living legend, pulling the attention of every patron. He offered a polite, quiet nod to the bartender, tipped his hat to a young couple staring with wide eyes, and walked out into the humid Texas heat. He climbed into his white Silverado, the engine roaring to life with a dependable growl that felt like a handshake from an old friend. He wasn't heading home to the ranch. He was heading into the belly of the beast. He was driving straight into the glass and steel heart of downtown Austin, to the headquarters of Nebula Stream, miles away, in a room that felt more like a spaceship than an office. The temperature was kept at a shivering 60 degrees. This was the command center of Nebula Stream, the world's most aggressive music streaming and data archiving corporation. The room was bathed in an aggressive blue neon glow, the only light source coming from walls of servers that blinked in a rhythmic, hypnotic dance. In the center of this digital cathedral sat Julian Thorne, a 30-year-old billionaire who viewed music not as art, but as code. Julian wore a t-shirt that cost more than most people's cars and sneakers that had never touched dirt. He spun in his ergonomic chair, staring at a massive monitor that dominated the wall. On the screen, a progress bar burned in ominous red. The file name was simple: Master File Strait Session 82 Wavier. Below it, a command prompt blinked with a terrifying finality. Julian took a sip of his kale smoothie, his eyes devoid of any reverence for the history he was looking at. To him, this file was just a leverage point, a piece of data that was causing too much legal trouble to keep on the official books. He didn't care about the Iron Horse Ranch. He didn't care about the veterans. He cared about the exclusive NFT auction he had secretly arranged with a private buyer in Shanghai, but to sell it, he had to make it disappear from the public ledger first. With a smirk that curled the corner of his lip, Julian extended a manicured finger and pressed the Enter key. The screen flashed. Delete sequence initiated. Purging from cloud. 20%, 40%, 80%. The numbers climbed rapidly, eating away the guitar strums and the soulful vocals of a young George Strait. Julian watched the history vanish with the same emotional detachment one might have while taking out the trash. 100%. Completed. File not found. The room fell into a heavy electronic silence, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans. Julian exhaled, satisfied. He believed he had just erased a problem. He had no idea he had just invited a hurricane to his doorstep. George Strait parked his truck in the underground garage of the Nebula Stream Tower. The vehicle looked out of place among the Teslas and Lamborghinis, a working horse in a stable of show ponies. He stepped out, his boots hitting the polished concrete with a heavy, deliberate thud. Clop, clop, clop. The sound echoed, announcing his arrival before he even reached the elevator. He carried a battered leather briefcase, the leather worn smooth by decades of use. Inside was not a laptop or a tablet, but a stack of papers and a belief in a handshake. He smoothed the front of his starch-pressed shirt, adjusted his belt buckle, and pressed the button for the penthouse. The elevator ride was swift and silent, the sensation of rising 40 floors in seconds unsettling for a man who preferred his feet on the ground. When the doors slid open, George was assaulted by the sterility of the modern world. The lobby of Nebula Stream was a blinding expanse of white marble and clear glass. There were no corners, only curves, no wood, only synthetic polymers. A receptionist sat behind a floating desk, wearing a headset and typing on a keyboard that made no sound. She didn't look up as George approached. "Excuse me, ma'am," George said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the glass walls. The receptionist jumped, startled by the sudden intrusion of a human sound in her digital bubble. She looked up, her eyes widening as she processed the man standing before her. It was like seeing a mountain suddenly appear in the middle of a shopping mall. Mr. Strait?" she stammered, pulling off her headset. "I have a meeting with Mr. Thorne," George said, his smile gentle but his eyes serious. "I believe I'm on time." "Yes, of course. Right this way. He's expecting you in the innovation pod." George suppressed a sigh. Innovation pod. He followed her down a long white corridor. Through the glass walls, he saw rows of young people hunched over screens, their faces illuminated by the pale light of code. None of them spoke to each other. They were all connected yet entirely alone. It was a strange, lonely world, George thought. A world that had forgotten the sound of a neighbor's voice. The receptionist swiped a card, and the glass doors to Julian Thorne's office slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Julian was standing by the window, looking out over the city of Austin, his back to the door. He didn't turn around immediately, a power move he had learned from a biography of Steve Jobs. "Mr. Strait," Julian said, his voice slick and overly friendly. "The king of country. To what do I owe the honor of a physical visit? I thought we handled everything via email these days." George walked into the room, the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor, the only real wood in the building, making Julian flinch slightly. George didn't sit down. He walked to the desk and placed his leather briefcase on the surface. "I don't do email when it comes to a man's livelihood, son," George said. "I'm here for the transfer. The Iron Horse Ranch is waiting on the funds from the release of the 82 session. We agreed that Nebula Stream would host the file for the charity auction today at noon." Julian finally turned around. He flashed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, yes. The 82 session. A beautiful piece of Americana. Truly." George narrowed his eyes. He had seen rattlesnakes with more warmth. "Is there a problem, Mr. Thorne?" Julian sighed, a theatrical gesture of regret. He walked over to his massive desk and tapped the sleek surface of his computer. He rotated the giant monitor so George could see it. The screen was black, save for a blinking error message in the center. "I'm afraid there is a problem, George," Julian said, dropping the formal title. "Technology, as advanced as it is still prone to hiccups. We experienced a catastrophic server failure this morning, a localized data rot. It seems the master file of your session was in the affected sector." George stared at the screen. He didn't understand the code, but he understood the lie. He looked from the screen to Julian's face. "You're telling me that a recording that survived 40 years in a cardboard box in a humid garage just vanished after 3 days in your billion-dollar computer?" Julian shrugged, leaning back against his desk. "It's the cloud, George. It's vapor. Sometimes it rains. We have backups, of course, but the corruption seems to have synchronized across our redundant systems. It's a tragic anomaly." George felt a heat rising in his chest, the kind of anger that didn't explode but hardened like concrete. "And what about the backup? The physical digitization you made?" "Lost," Julian said quickly. "Too quickly. But look, Nebula Stream is prepared to offer a consolation. We can use our AI engine to recreate the session. We have enough of your voice data to synthesize a new version. It will sound exactly like you, maybe even better. Pitch perfect. No background noise." George laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You want to replace a memory with a robot? You think the soul of a song is just data points?" "It's the future," Julian said, his tone sharpening. "And frankly, it's the only option. The file is gone. Poof. Deleted. There is nothing to sell." George took a step closer. Julian stiffened. George didn't raise his voice. but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. That file belongs to the men who fought for this country. It belongs to the families who are about to lose their home. You didn't just lose a file, son, you stole a future. Julian's mask slipped. He crossed his arms, his arrogance returning. Let's not be dramatic. It's an old tape. We'll cut a check for the inconvenience. A standard settlement. Take it and go back to your ranch. The world moves fast, George. Things get left behind. George looked at the young man, really looked at him. He saw the insecurity masked by wealth, the hollowness behind the eyes. He realized then that Julian wasn't just a businessman, he was a vandal, a man who would spray paint over a masterpiece because he didn't understand the brushstrokes. I'm not leaving without that file, George said softly. Then you'll be standing there a long time, Julian sneered. Security can show you out. As the tension in the room thickened to a suffocating density, something was happening outside the glass walls. Something Julian hadn't calculated. When the file was deleted, it didn't just vanish from Nebula Stream's internal view, it vanished from the public Coming Soon page that millions of fans had been refreshing since dawn. In a small apartment in Nashville, a teenage girl named Sarah, who ran the largest George Strait fan club on Twitter, saw the status change from available in 1 hour to 4:04 not found. She frowned. She refreshed. Nothing. She checked the source code of the page. She saw the deletion tag. Her fingers flew across her keyboard. In a basement in Tokyo, a collector of rare country music data noticed the hash key for the file had been scrubbed from the global index. He posted a query on a hacker forum. In a truck stop in Oklahoma, a trucker named Big Jim tried to pre-order the track to support the veterans, only to get an error message. He posted on Facebook, "Nebula Stream just screwed the king." The internet is a strange beast. It can be a place of hate and division, but it also has a long memory and a fierce loyalty to things that feel real, and nothing felt more real than George Strait. Within minutes, the spark lit the fuse. The hashtag, "Where is the file?" began to appear. At first it was a trickle, then a stream, then a river. Back in the office, Julian's phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again. Then it started vibrating continuously on the desk, dancing across the glass like a nervous beetle. He ignored it, staring down George Strait. "You think you can bully me with your cowboy stare?" Julian asked. "This is my building, my servers, my reality." George didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his own phone. It was an older model, scratched and simple. He looked at the screen. Even he could see the notifications piling up. "I think you might want to look at your reality, son," George said, nodding toward the giant monitor on the wall. Julian turned. The error message was gone. In its place, a news feed had popped up, triggered by the company's automated social listening software. The screen was flooded with tweets, posts, and videos. The stock ticker for Nebula Stream, usually a steady green line, showed a sudden, sharp dip. Julian's face went pale. "What is this? A bot attack?" "It's not bots," George said, his voice calm amidst the rising chaos. "It's people. You forgot about them, didn't you? You thought you were dealing with ones and zeros. But music connects people, and you just cut the line." The lights in the office flickered. The smart building system was struggling to handle the sudden influx of traffic hitting the company's public servers. The electronic blinds on the windows began to rise and fall erratically. Julian scrambled to his keyboard. "I can stop this, I can block the traffic." "You can't block the truth," George said. He walked over to the window, looking down at the street 40 stories below. He could see people stopping on the sidewalks, looking at their phones. He could see the world waking up. Julian was typing furiously now, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's just a glitch. I'll issue a press release. I'll say it was a hack." George turned back to him. "You're digging a hole, Julian, and the only way out is to give me what I came for. I told you. It's gone!" Julian shouted, his composure shattering. George knew he was lying. He could hear it in the pitch of his voice, see it in the twitch of his eye. A man like Julian didn't destroy assets. He hoarded them. The file wasn't deleted. It was hidden. Just then, the door to the office opened. It wasn't security. It was a woman in her 60s wearing a sensible cardigan and carrying a tray with 2 coffees. It was Martha, Julian's executive assistant, a woman who had worked at this address since before the building was even built, back when it was a department store. She had been invisible to Julian for 5 years. He treated her like office furniture. But Martha had ears, and Martha had grown up dancing at the Broken Spoke. She walked past the hyperventilating Julian and placed a coffee in front of George. She looked him in the eye, and for a second, the mask of the obedient employee dropped. "Black, 2 sugars. Just like you ordered in 82, Mr. Strait," she whispered. George looked at her, surprised. He recognized the kindness in her eyes. "Thank you, darling." Martha turned to leave, but as she passed George, she paused. Her voice was barely audible, a breath of air amidst the chaos of the flashing screens. "He didn't delete it," she murmured, her lips barely moving. "Drive Z, folder name Black Gold. It's partitioned for a private transfer to Shanghai at 2 p.m. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out, the glass doors hissing shut behind her. George looked at the clock on the wall. It was 1:45 p.m. He had 15 minutes before the file was sold and lost forever to a private server in China. He looked at Julian, who was screaming into his headset at the IT department. George took a sip of the coffee. It was hot, strong, and real. He set the cup down. The time for talking was over. The time for action had begun. "Julian," George said, his voice cutting through the CEO's panic. Julian ripped off his headset. "What? What do you want? Can't you see I'm handling a crisis?" "I'm not leaving," George repeated, "and neither are you. Not until we take a look at Drive Z." Julian froze. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a ghost. How do you know about Drive Z?" George tipped his hat back, a small knowing smile playing on his lips. "Like I said, son, the internet is searching hard, but sometimes you don't need the internet. You just need good people who remember what honor looks like." Julian lunged for the button under his desk, the panic button that would summon armed security, but George was faster, not in a running sense, but in a way that only a cowboy knows: anticipation. He kicked the heavy oak chair in front of the desk, jamming it against Julian's legs, pinning him to his seat. "Sit down," George commanded. "We're going to listen to some music." Julian Thorne sat pinned in his ergonomic mesh chair, the heavy oak guest chair wedged firmly against his knees. For the first time in his life, the billionaire prodigy looked small. The air conditioning in the penthouse hummed with a low, menacing vibration, but sweat was already beading on Julian's upper lip. He stared up at George Strait, expecting to see rage, expecting to see the kind of celebrity tantrum he was used to dealing with from pop stars who didn't get their way. But he saw none of that. He saw a calmness that was far more terrifying. It was the stillness of a man who had stared down bulls and weathered storms that would snap a lesser man in half. George didn't look like a singer in that moment. He looked like a judge. "You can't do this," Julian hissed, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to regain some semblance of authority. "This is kidnapping. This is false imprisonment. I have lawyers who will own everything you have. I'll take your ranch. I'll take your masters. I'll take the boots off your feet." George didn't blink. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pack of gum, offering a piece to Julian. Julian declined with a sharp jerk of his head. George unwrapped a piece for himself, folding the foil neatly and placing it back in his pocket. He moved with a deliberate slowness that seemed to mock the frantic digital clock on the wall. 1:48 p.m. 12 minutes until the transfer to Shanghai. "I'm not kidnapping you, son," George said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the floorboards. "I'm just keeping you company. You look a little stressed. And as for my boots, well, they've walked through mud deeper than your lawyers could ever wade through. Now about Drive Z." Julian's eyes darted to the computer screen. He tried to reach for the mouse, but George simply rested his hand on the desk, inches from Julian's fingers. It was a calloused hand, scarred from years of roping and guitar strings. It was a physical barrier that no firewall could protect against. "There is no Drive Z," Julian lied, though the desperation in his voice betrayed him. "Martha is senile. She doesn't know what she's talking about. It's a phantom drive, a system glitch." George sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He turned his head slightly, looking at the massive wall of glass that separated them from the world. Down below, the streets of Austin were beginning to clog. The digital outcry had bled into the physical world. A news helicopter was already circling the building, its rotors thumping rhythmically against the glass. "You know," George began, leaning back against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. "In 1982, when we cut that track, we didn't have auto-tune. We didn't have digital editing. If you missed a note, you started over. You had to be honest. If you were sad, it went on the tape. If you were tired, it went on the tape. There was no hiding." He looked back at Julian. "You've built a whole empire on hiding, haven't you? hiding behind terms of service, hiding behind algorithms, hiding files so you can sell them to the highest bidder while the people who need them starve. It's not hiding, it's asset management, Julian shouted, his face flushing red. You don't understand the market. That recording is a unique digital asset. If I release it to the public for charity, it's worth pennies per stream. If I sell it as a one-of-a-kind NFT to the collector in Shanghai, it's worth $20 million up front. I am maximizing value. That is my fiduciary duty. The admission hung in the air like smoke. George nodded slowly. 20 million, he repeated, and the ranch needs 200,000 to keep the lights on and the veterans fed. You were going to take 20 million for yourself and let brave men sleep in the cold. I was going to donate a portion, Julian stammered, realizing he had said too much. George leaned in close, his face inches from Julian's. The smell of expensive cologne clashed with the scent of old leather and rain that clung to George's jacket. A portion, George whispered. That's the difference between us, Julian. You give a portion. The men at that ranch gave everything. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. The overhead lights died instantly, leaving only the eerie blue glow of the server racks from the hallway and the massive monitors on the wall. The hum of the air conditioning sputtered and failed. The silence was sudden and heavy. Then, a low mechanical groan echoed through the building as the backup generators kicked in, bathing the room in emergency red lighting. "What did you do?" Julian shrieked, looking around wildly. "I didn't do anything," George said calmly, though his eyes were alert. On the wall, the massive monitor that had displayed the newsfeed flickered. The image of the news anchor distorted, tearing into digital artifacts. Static roared through the high-end speakers. Then, the screen went black. A second later, text began to scroll across the giant screen. It wasn't code. It wasn't a system error. It was messages. Thousands of them. Scrolling so fast, they were a blur of white text on a black background. Julian stared, his mouth agape. The firewall. They breached the firewall. How? "We have military-grade encryption." George watched the screen. He saw names he recognized. Fan clubs from Brazil, truckers from Canada, soldiers stationed in Germany. It wasn't a hacker group, it was a global community. They weren't using complex algorithms. They were using sheer overwhelming volume. They were knocking on the door so hard the hinges were coming off. "It seems," George said, a small smile touching his lips, "that you underestimated the bandwidth of a broken heart." The phone on Julian's desk lit up. It was the internal line. Julian grabbed it, his hand shaking. "Security! Get up here! Remove this man!" The voice on the other end was crackling and panicked. "Sir, we can't. The elevators are locked down. The system thinks there's a fire. The stairwell doors have magnetically sealed. We're trapped in the lobby. The whole building is glitching out." Julian slammed the phone down. He looked at George with pure terror. "You planned this? You have a team." George shook his head. "I have a guitar and a pickup truck, son. This is what happens when you push good people too far." 1:55 p.m. The red emergency lights pulsed. The heat in the room began to rise as the climate control failed. The monitor behind Julian changed again. The scrolling text vanished, replaced by a single, blinking command prompt. Julian gasped. They found the partition. They're trying to brute force it. George looked at the screen. He knew that if the hackers tried to guess the password and failed too many times, the system might auto-delete the file permanently as a security measure. Or worse, the automated transfer to Shanghai would trigger early. "Open it," George commanded. "I can't," Julian cried. "If I cancel the transfer now, the buyer will sue me for breach of contract. The penalty clauses are astronomical." George grabbed the lapels of Julian's designer jacket and pulled him forward, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Listen to me," George said, his voice hard as steel. "Out there right now at the Iron Horse Ranch, there's a man named Sergeant Miller. He lost his leg in 1968. He spends his days fixing fences and teaching kids how to ride horses because it's the only thing that keeps the nightmares away. That ranch is his life. If you sell that file to Shanghai, you aren't just selling a song, you are evicting a hero. Now, you can worry about a lawsuit from China, or you can worry about the fact that I am standing right here and I am not moving until you do the right thing." Julian looked into George's eyes. He saw the resolve. He saw the history. He realized that no amount of money could buy the kind of integrity staring back at him. He was a man who dealt in virtual realities, facing a man of absolute, concrete reality. 1:57 p.m. Julian panicked. It's triggered. The system thinks it's under attack. It's sending the file to safety. Stop it, George said. I have to input the master override, but it needs a biometric scan and a voice authorization. Do it. Julian's hands shook as he reached for the keyboard. He typed in a string of complex characters. The screen prompted, "Voice authentication required. Please speak the phrase." Julian looked at the screen. The phrase was a randomly generated security key. He cleared his throat. "Alpha, Tango, Vector, 9. Julian screamed. "It knows I'm panicked. It won't accept the voice print if my heart rate is too high." The countdown on the screen ticked down. 90 seconds. "Calm down," George said, his voice steady. "I can't. I'm losing $20 million. I'm losing my company." Julian was hyperventilating. George placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder. It was a grounding touch, firm and paternal. "Breathe, son. Forget the money. Just for a second. Forget the shareholders. Look at me." Julian looked up, his eyes wild. George lowered his voice, speaking with a melodic cadence, almost like he was starting a song. "You're just a man in a room. You made a mistake. We all make them. But you can fix this. You just have to tell the truth. The machine needs to hear your true voice, not the voice of a CEO, the voice of a human being." Julian took a ragged breath. He looked at the countdown. 60 seconds. He closed his eyes. He thought about Martha, the way she looked at him with disappointment. He thought about the angry text messages from his board of directors. He thought about the emptiness of his bank account compared to the fullness of the life George Strait seemed to lead. He pressed the microphone button again. He took a deep breath, trying to channel just a fraction of the calmness radiating from the cowboy beside him. "Alpha, Tango, Vector, 9. The room fell silent. The red lights pulsed. Julian slumped in his chair, exhausted. The screen changed. The countdown stopped at 45 seconds. The transfer to Shanghai was cancelled. A folder icon appeared on the desktop. It was labeled simply Black Gold. George didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He simply leaned over and tapped the Enter key. The folder opened. Inside was a single WAV file. George Strait, The Lost Session, 1982. The Weight of the Badge. "Play it," George said softly. Julian clicked the file. For a moment, there was only the hiss of tape, the digital artifact of an analog recording. And then the sound of an acoustic guitar filled the high-tech office. It was a simple chord progression, melancholic and sweet. Then a voice cut through the air. A younger George Strait, his voice higher, clearer, but carrying the same undeniable weight. "Well, the sun goes down on the Rio Grande, and the shadows stretch across the land. I promised I'd hold on. I promised I'd stay. But the cost of living is a high price to pay." The song wasn't a hit. It wasn't a toe-tapper. It was a ballad about loss, about holding on to land when the bank wants to take it, about the dignity of struggle. It was hauntingly beautiful. Julian listened. Really listened. For the first time in years, he wasn't analyzing the bitrate or the compression quality. He was hearing the story. He looked at George, who was standing with his head bowed, listening to his own younger self. Tears welled in Julian's eyes. He wiped them away quickly, ashamed. It's good," he whispered. "It's real," George corrected him. Suddenly, the door to the office shook violently. The magnetic locks disengaged with a loud clank. The door swung open, but it wasn't security. Standing in the doorway were 3 men. They were older, dressed in worn denim and flannel. One of them leaned heavily on a cane. Another wore a faded hat with a Vietnam veteran pin. It was the men from the Iron Horse Ranch. They had driven up from San Antonio when the news broke online. They had talked their way past the confused lobby staff, and when the elevators unlocked, they had come straight up. Behind them stood Martha, holding a key card. She had let them in. "Mr. Strait?" the man with the cane asked, his voice thick with emotion. "We saw the news. We thought it was gone." George turned, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. He walked over and shook the man's hand. "Sarge, you made good time." "We had to come," Sarge said. "That ranch, it's all we got." George turned back to Julian. The billionaire was looking at the veterans. He saw the mud on their boots, the lines on their faces, the cheap clothes that were clean and pressed with pride. He looked at the screen where the $20 million file sat open. He looked at the delete button. He looked at the Send to Public Domain button. The choice was no longer abstract. It was standing in his doorway. Julian stood up. His legs were shaky. He looked at George, then at Sarge, then at Martha. The arrogance was gone, peeled away by the pressure of the last hour and the purity of the song that was still playing softly in the background. He walked over to the veterans. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't feel he deserved one. Julian started, his voice cracking. I almost made a terrible mistake. He turned back to the computer. He looked at George one last time. Do it. George nodded. Julian reached out and clicked. Not on delete. Not on send to Shanghai. The screen flashed green. Upload complete. Instantly, the phones in the pockets of everyone in the room buzzed. The song was live. It was everywhere. In seconds, it was being downloaded in Tokyo, in London, in Brazil, and in the Broken Spoke Saloon. But the victory was short-lived. A siren began to wail. Not a digital alarm, but a real police siren from the street below. Blue and red lights flashed against the glass. The door to the office flew open again. This time it wasn't friends. 6 federal agents in windbreakers marked FBI Cyber Crime Division burst into the room, guns drawn. Julian put his hands up, looking confused. What is this? Agent in charge stepped forward. Julian Thorne, you're under arrest for securities fraud, international data trafficking, and the attempted illegal sale of protected cultural heritage assets. We've been monitoring the Black Gold drive for months. We just needed you to access it to confirm possession. George stood calmly to the side, his hands resting on his belt buckle. He looked at Julian, who was being handcuffed. You set me up, Julian asked, looking at George with betrayal. I didn't call them, son, George said, tipping his hat. But like I said, the internet search is hard. And when you light a fire that big, the smoke tends to draw attention. Julian was dragged out of the room, shouting about his lawyers. The room fell quiet, save for the veterans, Martha, and the king of country. George walked over to the computer where the song was still playing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive. He plugged it in, copied the file one last time for safekeeping, and pulled it out. He handed the USB drive to Sarge. Take this home, Sarge. It's yours. Sarge looked at the drive, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, George. You saved us. George smiled, picking up his briefcase. I just sang the song, Sarge. You boys did the saving a long time ago. He turned to Martha. Thank you for the coffee, darling. Martha blushed like a schoolgirl. Any time, Mr. Strait. George walked out of the office, his boots clicking on the floor. He headed for the elevator, leaving the high-tech world behind. He had a truck to drive and a long road back to Texas reality. But the story wasn't quite over. The world had heard the song, but they hadn't seen the man, and the crowd outside was waiting. The elevator descended with a smooth, silent grace that felt entirely at odds with the storm George Strait had just weathered on the 40th floor. The numbers above the door counted down, 30, 20, 10, marking his return from the sterile, cloud-based empire of Julian Thorne back to the solid ground of Texas. Inside the mirrored box, George stood alone. He adjusted the collar of his jacket and ran a hand along the brim of his resistal hat, checking the crease. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a corporate conspiracy. He looked like a man who was ready to go home and feed his horses. But the world outside the glass doors of the Nebula Stream Tower was not the same world he had entered an hour ago. When the elevator chimed at the lobby level, the sound was swallowed by a roar that vibrated through the floor. It wasn't the mechanical hum of servers. It was the organic, chaotic, beautiful sound of humanity. The lobby, previously a temple of quiet minimalism, was now barricaded by security guards, holding back a tide of people pressed against the exterior glass. George stepped out of the elevator. The receptionist, the one who had been so dismissive earlier, stood behind her desk, her mouth slightly open, holding her phone up to record him. She wasn't looking at a client anymore. She was looking at a folk hero. "Mr. Strait," she called out, her voice trembling. "The back exit is clear. Security says they can get your truck around to the alley. You can slip out unseen." George stopped. He looked at the back exit, a dark corridor that promised safety and anonymity. Then he looked at the front doors, where thousands of faces were pressed against the glass, holding signs, holding phones, holding old vinyl records. They were singing. Even through the thick, blast-proof glass, he could hear the muffled melody. They were singing Amarillo by Morning. "I don't sneak out back, darling," George said, his voice calm and steady. "I came in the front door. I'm leaving through the front door." He walked toward the main entrance. The security guards, seeing him approach, looked nervous. "Mr. Strait, we can't guarantee your safety," the head guard shouted over the noise. "It's a mob out there." "It's not a mob, son," George smiled, pushing the heavy glass door open. "It's an audience." As George stepped out onto the sidewalk of Congress Avenue, the roar became deafening. It was a physical wave of sound, cheers, whistles, applause, and the honking of horns. The street had been shut down. Traffic was gridlocked for blocks. People had climbed onto newsstands, bus stops, and the roofs of parked cars. The humid Austin air hit him, thick and familiar. Camera flashes popped like lightning in a summer storm. Reporters thrust microphones over the barricades, shouting questions about the FBI raid, about the hidden file about Julian Thorne. "George, is it true you hacked the mainframe? George, what did you say to Thorne? George, is the ranch saved?" George didn't answer the reporters. He raised a hand, and slowly, miraculously, the chaotic noise began to ebb. The shouting turned to murmurs, and the murmurs turned to a hush. Thousands of people waited, hanging on the moment. George looked out at the sea of faces. He saw teenagers with blue hair standing next to old cowboys with white mustaches. He saw suits standing next to mechanics. He saw the unity that the algorithm had tried to fragment. He didn't have a microphone. He didn't need one. He had the voice that had sold 100 million records. "I heard y'all were looking for a song," George projected, his voice carrying clear and true over the crowd. The crowd erupted again, then quieted just as quickly as he reached into his guitar case, which he had retrieved from the truck parked right at the curb. He pulled out his old acoustic Gibson, the wood scratched and worn, the finish checking from years of temperature changes between tour buses and stages. He rested his boot on the bumper of his white Silverado, using it as a makeshift stage. He strummed a G chord. It rang out, sharp and bright, cutting through the city noise. "This one's for the Iron Horse," George said, "and for anyone who's ever been told they were obsolete." He began to play "The Weight of the Badge," the song from the lost session, but he played it differently here on the street. It wasn't the melancholic whisper of the studio tape. It was an anthem. The crowd didn't know the words yet. The file had only been live for 20 minutes, but they hummed along, catching the rhythm, clapping on the 2 and the 4. As he sang about duty, about land, about the promise of a handshake, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a celebrity sighting anymore. It was a church service on asphalt. People cried, strangers hugged. For 3 minutes, the digital world of Nebula Stream towering above them didn't exist. There was only the wood, the wire, and the truth. When the final chord faded, ringing into the silence of the awestruck crowd, George didn't bow. He simply tipped his hat. "Thank you, Austin," he said. He put the guitar back in the case, climbed into the driver's seat of his truck, and started the engine. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a path for him. As he drove slowly through the tunnel of people, hands reached out just to touch the side of the truck, as if to confirm that he was real. George drove past the police cars that were now escorting a handcuffed Julian Thorne out of the building. Their eyes met for a fleeting second through the glass. Julian looked defeated, small, stripped of his digital armor. George didn't gloat. He offered a small, solemn nod, a final lesson in grace that Julian would likely remember for the rest of his life in federal prison. The truck turned the corner, accelerating onto the highway, heading west, heading home. 3 weeks later, the Texas sun was unforgiving, baking the red dirt of the Iron Horse Ranch until it cracked. But the mood on the property was anything but dry. It was a festival of resurrection. The foreclosure sign that had haunted the front gate for months was gone. In its place stood a brand new hand-carved sign, Iron Horse Ranch, East 1968, permanently protected. The release of the lost session had done more than just raise money. It had started a movement. The donate-to-download model, which Julian had mocked as archaic, had generated $4 million in the first 48 hours. The file hadn't just been downloaded, it had been shared, remixed, covered, and celebrated. It became the soundtrack of a weary nation looking for something solid to hold on to. In the South Pasture, a group of volunteers was rebuilding the perimeter fence. There were no contractors, just fans who had driven in from across the state to lend a hand. Among them, wearing a pair of heavy leather work gloves and a t-shirt stained with sweat and dirt, was George Strait. He wasn't supervising, he was working. He held a post steady while Sarge, the veteran who had stormed the office, hammered a staple into the wood. Sarge wiped his brow, leaning on his good leg. "You know, George, you don't have to be out here. We got plenty of hands. You paid for the materials. That's enough. George tested the post, shaking it. It didn't budge. Solid. I like the work, Sarge, George said, grabbing a pair of pliers. Keeps the calluses fresh. Besides, a song can buy the wood, but it takes sweat to build the fence. Sarge looked out over the ranch. In the distance, horses were running in the paddock. A group of veterans with PTSD were grooming a mare, their movements calm and therapeutic. The laughter of children, families of the vets, drifted on the wind. I never thought I'd see this place safe, Sarge admitted, his voice thick. When that computer fella said the file was gone, I thought we were done. I thought history was just something you could delete. George looked up at the vast blue Texas sky. A hawk circled high above, riding a thermal current. You can't delete history, Sarge. You can try to hide it. You can try to rewrite it. You can bury it under a mountain of servers and lies. But the truth is like water. It always finds a way to seep through the cracks. Sarge nodded. They say that Julian Kidd is facing 20 years. Fraud, embezzlement. His company stock is worth less than this fence post. I don't wish him ill, George said, moving to the next post. He just got lost. Forgot where he came from. Forgot that you can't digitize a soul. A black SUV pulled up the long gravel driveway. A woman in a sharp business suit stepped out, holding a clipboard. It was a representative from the Library of Congress. She walked over to the fence line, looking out of place in her heels, but respectful. "Mr. Strait?" she asked. George stood up, dusting off his jeans. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here for the master tape," she said. "The original reel-to-reel. We've inducted the lost session into the National Recording Registry. We want to preserve it in the vault in Washington, to ensure it's never lost again." George looked at Sarge. Sarge smiled and reached into his truck, pulling out the battered cardboard box that contained the original 1982 tape. He handed it to George. George held the box. It was light, just plastic and magnetic tape, but it felt heavy with the weight of the last few weeks. He handed it to the woman. "You take good care of that," he said. "It's got a lot of miles on it." "We will, Mr. Strait. It will be kept in a climate-controlled, radiation-proof vault. It will last forever." George smiled, a genuine crinkling of the eyes. "Nothing lasts forever, ma'am. But if you treat it right, it lasts long enough." The woman nodded, took the box, and drove away. George watched the dust settle behind the SUV. The physical artifact was gone, safe in a museum. But the music was here, in the air, in the rhythm of the hammers hitting the fence posts, in the laughter of the veterans. That night, the celebration moved to the barn. It wasn't a gala, it was a potluck. Tables were groaned under the weight of brisket, potato salad, and peach cobbler. A local band was setting up in the corner, tuning their instruments. George sat at a table in the back, nursing a Dr. Pepper. He was tired. His back ached from the fencing work, but it was a good ache, the kind that let you sleep at night. Martha, the executive assistant from Nebula Stream, walked in. She looked different. She had traded her grey office cardigan for a denim jacket. She looked 10 years younger. She spotted George and walked over. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. George pulled out a chair. "Please do, Martha. How's the job hunt coming?" "Oh, I'm not hunting," she smiled. "The new board of directors at Nebula Stream called. They want me to run the transition team. They want to pivot the company. Less disruption, more preservation. They want to build a digital archive for heritage music, and they want me to lead it." George chuckled. "Well, I reckon they finally found someone with some sense. You gonna take it?" "I might," she said. "On one condition, no more locked doors, and real coffee in the break room." They both laughed. The band kicked into a two-step. It was a cover of Unwound. Sarge walked up to the microphone. He tapped it, the feedback squealing slightly. "Attention, everyone," he shouted. The room went quiet. "We got a special guest tonight," Sarge said. "A man who needs no introduction. But I'm going to introduce him anyway. The man who taught a computer a lesson about country music, Mr. George Strait." The room exploded in applause. George shook his head, smiling, trying to wave it off. But the chant began. "George! George! George!" He stood up. He walked to the stage. He didn't take the center mic. He picked up a fiddle from the band's stand. He hadn't played fiddle in public in years, but tonight felt right for something different. He leaned into the microphone. "I think y'all heard enough of my voice lately," George said. "Tonight, I just want to be part of the band." He nodded to the drummer. 1, 2, 3, 4. The band launched into San Antonio Rose. George played the fiddle part, his bow flying across the strings. He wasn't the star. He was just a musician in a barn, playing for his friends, playing for the ghosts of the past and playing for the promise of tomorrow. Outside, the Texas night was vast and starry. The constellation of Orion hung low over the horizon. The digital world continued to spin, servers humming, data streaming, likes and shares tallying up in the invisible cloud. But down here, on the dirt, the music was analog. It vibrated in the floorboards. It resonated in the chests of the people dancing. As the song ended and the cheers rose up to the rafters, George looked out at the crowd. He saw Sarge dancing with his wife for the first time in 20 years. He saw Martha laughing. He saw the life that had been protected. He realized then that the fight hadn't been about a file. It hadn't been about copyright or contracts. It had been about the simple, undeniable fact that some things cannot be coded. Honor is not an algorithm. Compassion is not a download. And a legacy is not what you save on a hard drive. It is what you sow in the ground and nurture with your own 2 hands. George Strait packed his fiddle away. He shook hands, took pictures, and slowly made his way to the door. He stepped out into the cool night air. The silence of the ranch was a stark contrast to the noise of the barn. He walked to his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots. He looked back one last time at the lighted windows of the barn, the silhouette of the dancers moving against the yellow glow. He smiled, climbed into his truck, and turned the key. The radio flickered to life. It was a local AM station. The static cleared, and through the speakers came a familiar sound. It was the crackle of a vinyl record, followed by the opening chords of The Weight of the Badge. George turned the volume up just a little. He shifted into gear and drove down the long driveway, his headlights cutting a path through the darkness. He wasn't riding off into the sunset. The sun had long since gone down. He was riding into the rest of his life, with the quiet satisfaction of a cowboy who had done his job, kept his word, and reminded the world that even in the age of the cloud, you still need to keep your boots on the ground.